Hey guys, sorry about the technical problems. I will freely admit that I am not good at PowerPoint. I am much better at malware and reverse engineering, so let me assure you right now that we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. So this is driving vulnerabilities, navigating the road of bring your own driver attacks. So this is me. I'm Dana Behling. I'm a wife, a mom, and a threat researcher, in that order. I have 2 boys. That's a picture of them on the bottom, and my husband. I work at VMware Carbon Black, and it is a phenomenal job. They paid for me to be here, and so I'm very grateful for the job, and I'm very thankful to be able to speak with you today, because you guys showed up for the talk that's after lunch on the last day, which means that you guys are hardcore and awesome. You're the people I want to talk to. So before I worked for VMware Carbon Black, I was a government contractor. I worked for Leidos for about 5 years, where I reverse engineered malware, wrote reports, and generally explained how stuff works to manager-type people. And then before that, I was a NSA civilian for 11 years, and that was a phenomenal job. I'm sure there's some of you in the crowd. Don't speak up now. But that was also great because it gave me the opportunity to reverse hardware, reverse software, forward engineer software, be a technical director, and hold all sorts of jobs. So it was also a phenomenal experience. And before that, I got my degree at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So any people from Hawaii here? Go Bows. So bring your own vulnerable drivers. This talk is admittedly a pretty technical talk. But if you remember back at the last slide, I told you I was a wife and a mom in that order. I'm going to get to a point here. I want to let you know that even though that it's a technical talk, don't leave. Even if you're not a super technical person that looks at assembly on an everyday basis like I do, you're going to be able to follow this talk. As a mom, you learn how to answer really difficult questions from these bright-eyed 10-year-olds who want to know how video game hacks work, and they don't have the background to understand all the complexity of how the video games hacks works, but you figure out a way to explain it to them to foster their curiosity. And so I'm going to do that for you today, like maybe not to the level of a 10-year-old, but to a level that everyone here will be able to understand it. So hang on to your seats. We're going to have fun today. So to do that, I'm first going to give you a baseline of essential knowledge you might need to know about Windows drivers, just to make the vulnerabilities make more sense later on. And then we're going to talk about 3 main types of vulnerabilities that are commonly seen in Windows drivers. And this is mostly about Windows. A lot of the concepts carry over to the other operating systems, but we only have 1 hour, so we're going to focus on Windows here. The vulnerabilities we'll talk about are vulnerabilities in the special kernel-only registers that is in the x86 assembly language. We're going to talk about I/O control vulnerabilities. If you saw Andrew Case's talk, he was before me at lunch. Phenomenal talk. I hope you listen to that because this carries over about what he talked about. And then we're also going to talk about plug-and-play drivers and how it's a new attack vector for privilege escalation, and I'll explain how all that works, and I guarantee you're going to understand it, and you're going to walk out, and you're going to say, oh, I'm glad I came to that talk. The last thing is we're going to wrap up, and if you have questions for me, hopefully I'll have an answer for you. If not, I will research it and email you later. So drivers. We've had drivers from the beginning, right? We've always needed software to be able to manipulate the hardware, and that's what drivers are, plain and simple. In the 90s, we had rootkits. If you, again, saw Andrew Case's talk before mine, he talked all about rootkits. Rootkits, basically, whenever malware hides in the kernel, so that way it's hard to remove or extremely persistent, very stealthy. In the 90s, really, I put the 90s because that's whenever we first started seeing malware in the kernel, but really the golden age of rootkits in the kernel was like the 2000s. There was like Zeus and Stuxnet. They had like all these hidden file systems and stuff. So that's what we saw in the 2000s. The first use of a driver to commit malicious acts, though, was really Shamoon. I don't know if anybody remembers Shamoon. It was like ancient history, 2012. But basically, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of what happened there, was that there was a driver, it was called the raw disk driver. And basically what it would do is you would be able to run it on your system, and it would allow you to partition your drives and basically do all the low-level drive manipulations that you wanted to do in an easy way. And so what happened was some folks didn't like the Saudi Aramco. So what they did was they overwrite all of the hard drives on the Saudi Aramco network. That included the master boot record. Like, everything was wiped out. They ended up having to just get all new computers. So that happened in 2012. And the interesting thing about that attack in general is that the driver itself was not vulnerable. There was no vulnerability in that driver. They just applied it in a very mean way, especially if you were Saudi Aramco. And then the next one I wanted to say in the timeline is WannaCrypt. So if you've been in the industry for any amount of time, you're probably familiar with WannaCrypt. WannaCrypt used the NSA Eternal Blue exploit for SMB to overwrite a special purpose register that would allow it to basically run some special code that basically wormed it around the entire world. So, and so that was really the first use of a driver who was vulnerable being used to weaponize malware, and it spread all around the world. It was a real disaster. But today, we're seeing an increase in bring your own vulnerable driver attacks. In fact, just last week I saw one. It was the OWL killer, AUKILL. Sophos wrote a report about it. And basically what it does is it takes the Process Explorer driver, and you know what it does? It just goes through the process list, kills all the processes it doesn't want running when the malware runs. Plain and simple. I'm really not exaggerating. It's that easy. So, and you can guess what process it wants to kill, right? All of the security processes. So when we think of drivers, what do we think of? We think we have our operating system and we have a device. So we need to install a driver. If you're old like me, you think of CD-ROMs, which drivers don't come on CD-ROMs anymore, but for some reason I still think of that. And you install it and then your device works. So it's like pretty simple, like one-to-one. No, not quite. So drivers work in a stacked formation. There are a ton of drivers. The reason that is, and if you think about it, of course, no device is a standalone thing that will work independently. It's going to have to coordinate with all the other devices on the operating system, right? So the drivers work in stacks and they work with each other. So it ends up being like the drivers are like this, having this cacophony of conversation going on between all the devices on the system and the operating system. It's not a one-to-one, like I think of it, at least. So this is my favorite chart about drivers. It's really boring, but it explains perfectly drivers and the Windows operating system, and I love it so much I have it on a whole bunch of slides in the future. But I'm going to explain all the little boxes on here, and it really will help you during the rest of the talk to understand what's going on. So there's a whole, just like I said, like drivers work in stacks, there's a whole bunch of different types of drivers. And I can explain them to you from the top down or the bottom up, but we're going to talk about it from the bottom up, I guess. So at the very bottom level, you have So you have the drivers are like the very lowest level drivers, and they call them bus drivers because, computer bus, but I always think of my third grade bus driver, Phyllis. She was awesome. But anyway, so they actually control the I/O with the hardware itself. It's the very lowest level drivers. We're not going to really talk too much about those today. But the two other ones that are important to think about on this slide are kernel mode drivers and file system drivers. Next up from the bus drivers are these kernel mode drivers. Kernel mode drivers can be written by Microsoft or the operating system company, but the majority of them, the very large majority of them, are written by third-party vendors who have hardware that want to run on Windows. And that is where we're going to focus most of our attention today. There's also file system drivers. File system drivers are like on the top of that kernel level driver stack. And they basically control the file system, so writing and where everything is on disk, like NTFS FAT. And then if you notice, there's this one driver up here above this dotted line called the user mode driver. So if you have a video card that has the cool LED lights like on it, so that way you could change it from green to red, chances are when you installed it, it came with a user interface, right? So you can like change those cool LED lights. What's doing that is the user mode driver. So the user mode driver is allowed from user space to talk to the kernel mode driver, which is actually implementing the action that will change those light colors. And one other thing that is very important to note for the rest of the presentation, and you probably already know this, but I'm going to go ahead and explain it anyway, is you see the dotted line separating user mode and kernel mode. A lot of people, I don't know, they think it's super complicated. It's not all that complicated. Basically, user mode uses one set of libraries, kernel mode uses another set of libraries, and the communication between the two is just restricted. So you can only talk to each other through specific means. I kind of think of user mode as like a punk rock concert. So it's all chaotic. There's probably a mosh pit, you know, guitars and people yelling into microphones. And then down here in kernel mode, it's like a concert at the Peabody or like the New York Philharmonic. So everything is organized and there's like super lot of rules, like even a dress code. So that's the way I think of whenever I think of the difference between user mode and kernel mode. You definitely don't want any of those punk rockers in the New York Philharmonic. So the first vulnerability we're going to talk about are MSRs in BYODs. So MSRs are model-specific registers. They were registers implemented by Intel, I don't know, super long time ago, and they were originally implemented just to be debug registers, but they found them so useful that they actually opened them up to the kernel, and they provide some very unique functionality. There's a couple that I wanted to point out in particular that I put on the slide. This is a screenshot directly from the x86 assembly language manual, which is really boring, but has some great information. So basically, if you look at this L star register right here, it's IA32_L star. Everybody calls it L star for short. It says the target RIP for the called procedure when syscall is executed in 64-bit mode. That doesn't make sense. Why do they have to talk like that? Basically, all it means is that whatever is in RIP, that stands for instruction pointer, when syscall is called, whatever's in there, it's going to be called as if it was from the kernel. So, you guys like treasure hunts or scavenger hunts? You guys like those? I like those too. So this is the way I explain instruction pointers to my kids. So they're young, so they enjoy these, like we call them treasure hunts. What it is, I write little clues on pieces of paper and I hide them all over the house. Like one piece of paper might say, look under the couch cushion, and another one might say, they go to the couch cushion and they look at the note and it says, go look under the chair. And then they go look under the chair and there's another note. It says, look under the table. So those notes in the treasure hunt are basically the instruction pointers, okay? So there's a point to this. So in WannaCrypt, what they did was they hooked the instruction pointer. So if you think of my treasure hunt notes as the instruction pointer. What they did is whenever I gave my kid the first note, it said, look under the chair, and he looked under the chair. And then whenever he looked under the chair, there was a note that said, oh, go take your mom's car on a joyride, eat all the ice cream. And then, by the way, go look under the table. So it just kind of, it gave them it pointed to shell code. Everybody knows what shell code is, right? It's a little extra bit of the program. Like in my example, they were going on a joyride. But that's what it did. So it replaced L star with an instruction that had shell code. And this is what the shell code looks like. So if you look up here, everybody, you got this. You got this, okay? I know that people get panicked whenever they start seeing Ghidra on the screen. It's not hard to understand when somebody explains it to you. So this is disassembly from Ghidra. It shows how they're setting up, putting the address in that register we talked about before, the L star register, and then making this system call, the WRMSR, to trigger that shell code, so that way my kids can take my car for a joyride, right? And so if you look, I want you to focus on this 0F30, because that's the call to the WRMSR. And then you also have all of these 8 Bs up here. That's just move, because I don't want to read hex. It's easier for me to read like this, English version. This is a real sample, by the way, from the Black Moon malware. It's also called KR Banker. Oh. So what we can do is, now that we know that's how they're setting that up, is that we can write a YAR rule to find all of the vulnerable drivers that are out there that actually implement this technique, right? So if you look here, I told you to pay attention to that B9. Was it B9? That's that move instruction. And then the 0F03, all of these are basically all the same thing. It looks like a big block of scary text, but it's all exactly the same thing. It's just different iterations and different ways that could appear in code. And so what we're doing is that we know that all drivers are going to call this IO create device, and that's the way that we know that it's a driver. That's a function that will be in the driver code itself, and that function will appear as that string, IO create device. So by including that in the YARA signature, we're guaranteeing that it's a driver. The other 2 strings there, IO create device secure and IO create device, WDM lib IO create device, those are just basically the same function that does the same thing, it's just a different name. And then down there. So what we're doing is we're just looking through YARA to find drivers that implement that. And so whenever you run that, you find really interesting things. So if you look up there, you'll see, 3 hits in virus total. But then if you click on the relations tab, look at all the hits. 3649, I think that might be a vulnerable driver that malware is using to hurt your system. And YARA is something that's very easy that network administrators could run to look for vulnerable drivers in their own environments. So it's something that not only malware analysts can use. So, but, we had that great talk right before lunch about patch guard. Everybody calls it patch guard. I don't know why. I guess maybe that's an old name. But if you go in the Windows documentation, they always call it virtualization-based security. Maybe it sounds more authoritative that way. And everybody's really afraid of patch guard. Even the most smartest people I know, when you talk to them about patch guard, they're like, I don't want to talk about that. It gives me a headache. But I'm going to tell you all about patch guard right now. Super easy, and then you can impress all your technical friends that you know about patch guard right now. Super easy. Okay, so the first thing is SMEP. That's the one piece of patch guard, and it was the first thing that Microsoft implemented, right? So SMEP, you know what it does? It says, if you're using that register that I talked to you about, the L star, you can't call user mode from that. If you try to do that, we're going to blue screen your box. So basically, no calls from kernel mode to user mode. That's not hard to understand, right? Okay, so that was the first thing Microsoft did, SMEP. Second thing, guess what? Guess what? After they implemented that, what the hackers did? Oh, well, there's a whole bunch of unallocated user space in the kernel mode. So I'm just going to move all of my malicious code that used to be in user space into this unallocated space in kernel mode and call it from there. But Microsoft said, not so fast. They have a little bit of mom in them too, I think. And so they called that device guard. So SMEP, no kernel calls from user mode, and device guard, no kernel calls from unallocated space in the kernel. And then the last part of it is the memory integrity module. And basically what that means is that all of those special purpose registers that are only available to privileged processes, we're going to monitor those. And if they have unauthorized changes by unauthorized applications, we're going to, again, blue screen your box. That's memory integrity. So it's not that hard to understand, right? We got that. That's easy. So if anybody says patch guard is mind-boggling, hey, you got this now. You can explain it to them. So this is one of my very favorite quotes. I love it. It says, when you have a tough job in a plant, this is from the president of, I think, the Chrysler company, like way back whenever, I don't know, super long time ago. If I have a tough job in a plant and I can't find an easy way to do it, I have a lazy man put on it. He'll find an easy way to do it in 10 days. And then we'll just use that method. It's like, so they even had hackers way back then, even before computers were so plethora. A lot of people attribute this quote to Bill Gates for some reason, but it wasn't Bill Gates. It was good old Clarence. And I agree with it. And I think we as a community and hackers in general, good and bad, do this a lot, which brings me to my next type of attack, which is the I/O control attack. So the way the drivers work is that, like I was talking before about the video cards, you'll have the user mode section of the video card, which allows you to, adjust the fan speed, adjust the lights, adjust how the colors are processed or whatnot. And then you have that the actual driver that can implement those changes. So on the user mode side, you'll have the I/O control triggers, and on the kernel mode side, you'll have the I/O control actions. So basically what it looks like is this. It's 8-digit hex byte value. They're circled in green there, or squared in green, I guess. And basically what it is that there'll be one of these hex byte values in the user mode side, and then there's the hex byte value in the driver side. This happens to be the driver side. And so as you can see, this one, 8002000, will give you the map view of the entire drive. So you can map virtual address space to real address space. Kind of useful if you're an attacker, I would say. Well, I'll get it one of these days. So on the kernel side, in order to have a driver, you have to have there's two functions that you can choose to implement your driver. These are the two functions you can choose. You have IO create device, or you have WDM libIO create device secure. The IO create device, the one on the left, is the old one, which doesn't implement any security at all. And then the one on the right is the newer one, in which you can pass the Windows credentials to the driver when you create it. And the way that you send your IO control call to your driver is super easy. So you create your device using one of these two functions, and then you can authenticate with it. That's completely optional, by the way. You can absolutely create it with the IO create device function with no security at all, and then send IO control codes to it and have do whatever you want in the kernel. And then you just send the command, and the command is just that 8-byte hex value. So let's talk about the authentication, right? What are your options here? So like I said, you can send your Windows credentials and tokens, and you can authenticate using just like the built-in Windows authentication facilities that they make available to the users, which is really great, except for that most drivers don't bother implementing those. Another thing that I've heard talked about, but I've never seen actually used, is that you can allow the driver to take the digital signature of the calling program, so that way it ensures that the command that it's receiving is from the actual bona fide application that it's supposed to be talking to. I've seen it, like in theory, talked about, but I've never actually seen it implemented in a driver. And then the third way, and probably the most ironclad way to protect that communication between the user mode and the kernel mode would be like a TLS-like communication, which would require like a third-party server to validate the fact that both sides were talking to each other, and then also protect that communication between the two driver and user mode side, which, like, as far as I know, no one has ever done that. I actually looked for it because I read on a forum where driver developers were talking about it, and I actually wrote some YARA rules trying to find an example. I could not find anything, so I think it's just theory. And then on the user side, the way that you send the codes is by using this function, device IO control, and it allows you to send whatever of those 8 byte hex digits. This is what it looks like on the user mode side. This is basically the same code. The top is assembly, and then the one is decompiled code, just to make it easier for everybody. It's super easy. Oh, and the way that you create a handle to the device, oh, this is really complicated. Hold on to your seats. You call create file. Yes, create file. And you just give it the name of the driver. So now that we know all about how vulnerable drivers with I/O controls work, let's hunt for some. So here's a YARA rule that I wrote. And this one doesn't look for all drivers with I/O controls because, honestly, there's just way too many. There's way too many. So this one is looking for vulnerable signed drivers that also have the ability to do thread manipulation. So it sort of narrows it down a bit, so that way I don't have so many drivers to look through. And basically, we can ignore the strings portion, like the top portion up here, because all of the variables are basically the same thing that they define. So we're just going to focus on this condition section here. So if we look at the conditions, basically the top one is just saying we want to make sure we're looking at a driver. And like I told you already, those are the 2 functions you have to call if you want to make a driver. So the driver will have one of those functions in it. And then this part in the middle, this is the part where I'm limiting it to only functions that limiting the drivers to only those that can do process manipulation. And the way that I found those is just by basically being a developer and looking for, if I wanted to do process manipulation, what functions would I use? So those are those. And then probably the most important and the most interesting part for you is this not section down here. See what that is? It's saying, I only want to look at the drivers that aren't implementing security. It's really that easy. It's like strings. I didn't even show you any bytecode in this one, right? And then, of course, on the bottom, it's saying, I only want to look at drivers whose timestamps were valid, or I only want to see drivers whose signatures were valid at the time that it was compiled. So it could be an old driver, but yeah, so signed, valid drivers that don't implement security. And so this is what you get. I think this is just one screenshot of one page, but whenever I ran it, I got about 100 drivers back, and this is what you get. You can see, yeah, some of them are flagged as malicious, but the very large majority are not. It's really crazy. And then plug-and-play drivers. Plug-and-play drivers, they're They're fun too. They don't provide as much functionality in the form of exploitation as the I/O control, because basically with I/O control drivers, you can do anything you want. But plug-and-play drivers do provide a good mode for privilege escalation. And, oh, I told you I would torture you with this graph, right? So if we look at this graph, I already explained to you user mode, kernel mode, and all the different types of drivers. But what they did for plug and play, what Microsoft did, was see where the dotted line is, the dashed line? What they did was they basically like put in a whole bunch of libraries in between the user mode and kernel mode right there. And what they did, it looks like this. So if I was like really good at graphic arts, I would like have put that in there, but I'm not, so this is what you get. But imagine that this is like on that dotted line on the other graph. And basically what it does is it put a manager on each side to manage the operating system, calls necessary to perform the privilege escalation in order to, well, it's not a privilege escalation, it's I can't think of like the legitimate word for it. They are doing a privilege escalation, but it's a legitimate privilege escalation, so that way they can install the driver behind the user's back without any user interaction. Because it's great when things just work and you can plug stuff in. The problem with it is that sometimes, like whenever these drivers, the plug-and-play drivers actually install themselves, or whenever you plug in your mouse, it will install itself, and then it will forget to reduce the privilege level after it's installed, right? So it elevates the privilege to do all the actions necessary for the device to work, and then it just like hangs there. So you plug in your device, and plugging in the device gives you system access, and that's all you need. Like, it sounds too simple, but yes, that's the way it works. These are the steps that the co-installers go through, and it just occurred to me that I didn't explain to you what co-installers were. So co-installers are the part of the plug-and-play drivers that provide user feedback. So say you have a, I don't know, high-performance gamer mouse, right? And I know of a mouse in particular that has this vulnerability. You plug it in, and it might pop up a little user screen that lets you choose what each button does on the mouse, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so a co-installer is that window that pops up that allows you to configure the mouse. And that's where all of the problems are. So we can also hunt for drivers that have these plug-and-play vulnerabilities, that have co-installers, that will elevate the privilege and then not necessarily reduce or take the privilege back down to user level. And it's basically the same techniques that I did before. Make sure that you're looking at a driver, first line. Make sure you're looking at a driver that doesn't implement security. And then this is the call that is used for the co-installers right here. There's actually two calls you can make. One is the EX version, which has additional parameters, and then one is like the regular one. But we're just looking, it'll match on either one if we use that, so it's there. And then again, we're looking for only things with valid signatures. And so if we I didn't show you what I got back from that. Oh, I got 160 matches. There you go. You can see it up there. So yeah, there's a lot of those out there. So, but you're probably thinking to yourself, well, no one's going to come to my house and plug in a mouse so they can get privilege escalation, right? Well, they don't have to come to your house. It just has to be plugged in. With PNP util, you can basically exercise any driver for any device that's currently plugged in. So, if you do have a vulnerable mouse in particular, you might want to get rid of it. There was a guy, Will Dorman, on Twitter, whenever this vulnerability first come into public view, who saw and noticed this, is that if you want to disable those co-installers, instead of getting rid of your mouse, you can set this registry value. It wasn't set on any of my Windows machines, so I think you have to go in and manually create it and make it. But basically, it's just this disable co-installers right here. You set it to regword at 1, and that will disable all of your co-installers. So, but then you're not going to be able to install your mouse anymore. So it's kind of a drawback. So, I finished super early. I'm sorry, guys, but we can talk about anything you want. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than willing to take questions. I didn't on purpose talk about firmware bootloaders or UEFI. We could talk about driver signature enforcement. It would be a little bit redundant since Andrew Case just talked about it in a lot of detail in the last talk. But that's all I have for you today. Sure. One thing I didn't talk about that I did want to mention is that the threat landscape for the bring your own vulnerable drivers is extremely prolific right now. In the course of my work, I see a lot of actors employing these vulnerable drivers. And there are some security mechanisms, like Microsoft does have the driver signing. But it seems to me that a lot of the techniques that people are using to prevent them is sort of a whack-a-mole solution, right? They're just saying, oh, there's a vulnerable driver. I'm going to add the hash of that driver to the block list. And so it's a terrible way to handle it. And we know, especially with the I/O controls, I showed you how easy it was to see if there was security implemented in the in the driver itself. The problem is that Microsoft is allowing the driver writers basically carte blanche to perform whatever authentication that they want to perform. So they have the choice of using the Microsoft embedded security mechanisms or to completely roll their own security mechanisms. And anybody who has been in the industry for more than 5 minutes knows that rolling your own security mechanisms is always a bad idea. So why are we allowing it in the most protected part of the operating system with these I/O control commands? And Microsoft is co-signing these, so I assume that they do have some sort of automated process where they're trying to check for these things, but there's a lot of old drivers out there. They're obviously not being 100% thorough with their checking.
Where have you seen this more prolific in on-prem environments like data centers or more from a continuity perspective?
So yeah, from a threat hunting perspective, just in customer environments.
So also on-premise and data center environments?
To me, if it's on-prem or in a data center environment, it's sort of transparent to me because I just see the endpoint systems and how the endpoint systems are affected. It doesn't really matter to me where it is physically located, whether it be on a rack of Linux servers or actually like a dusty box under someone's desk. Like it works the same, really, from my perspective as a malware analyst.
In your workflow, besides tools like OSR Loader, are there any scripts that you do or any tools that stand out to you that help you in your analysis?
A lot of WinDebug. Yeah. Yeah, I always like wish like there was like some genius out there that would make like some like great replacement for WinDebug, but really WinDebug is the only one that I've found that really works well for drivers. Yeah. And you get used to it, you know. It's like the grumpy uncle at the family reunion. Yeah. Yeah, he's grumpy, but he's our uncle. So, any other questions?
From your perspective as a malware analyst, you said that people are doing whack-a-mole right now. What would you think a good approach to detecting exploitation or abuse of never foreseen driver vehicle?
One of the easiest things you can do is get a copy of my slides and see those YAR rules, run it in your environment, see if any of your drivers in your environment hit against those YAR rules. And there's drivers all the time that are being discovered to have these vulnerabilities. NVIDIA drivers, there was recently the Process Explorer driver, I could just like make a list super long, and it's very surprising to me that these type of defects can get out the door. I think that it's just because no one was looking at this for so long that like we just kind of got complacent. Not that anyone's being nefarious at all. Sorry.
When you talk about the security keys of these drivers, how easy would it be for an attacker to grab one of those tokens and use it to escalate privileges or execute other malicious activity?
Oh, very easy. You don't even have to be in the driver to copy someone's tokens. There are a lot of like well-known token duplication attacks for different processes. But yeah, the problem here is that they don't even have that level of security, not even tokens, nothing. It's like anybody can call those IO control commands. At least if they had tokens, they'd have something. But yeah, you're right. You do have a good point that it would be very easy to copy those tokens and then use those tokens even if the Windows security was implemented in the drivers.
Do you have any contact information or blog posts about this?
Oh, yes, there is a blog post that doesn't go into this much detail on the VMware website. If you, I don't remember what the name of it is, but if you search BYOD and then VMware, it'll pop up. And then I also have my contact information there. I don't actually like tweet or like toot if you're using Mastodon, but I will reply to you if you reach out to me. I'm just a lurker. Like I'm too afraid to like actually talk on there. Yeah, that's it. Watch out for those drivers.